Hello friends, my name is AJ and welcome to my channel. This is going to be your in-depth review for Unit 5 of AP Computer Science, which is writing classes. So if you remember on the AP exam, or for the AP Computer Science exam website, on the FRQ section, there is a question that asks you to fully and completely write a class. So it is pretty much exclusively all of this material that is in Unit 5. Now, because of the coronavirus pandemic, they have canceled that question. That question will not be on the AP exam. I actually had a video about 2 days ago in the in my channel, and there may be a link in the description or in the comment section below for it. And that pretty much goes over the actual structure for the new 2020 AP exam. But if you're taking the AP exam 4 years after, then it will not matter. You will definitely have a question on the FRQ section that requires you to completely write a class. Now, the good news about this unit is that you actually learned everything in Unit 2 that you need for this unit. And especially in the review that I went over all of these things already. So this unit is pretty much just taking everything that you've learned so far and kind of putting it together to be able to properly and completely write classes now. And if you remember, and if you have been following the channel and have been doing the Unit 2 practice exam, which is in the description below that I made of that video, in the FRQ section for that particular unit review was actually writing a class. So you've already done a lot of these things. Now it's just getting more practice with them and kind of going over some of the things. So I'll be going, this particular video, which will be part 1, will go over all of those things as a recap, because pretty much this entire unit is a recap. And then the second part of the video will be off of a practice test, again, even for this unit, that I have created for you. It will be in the description below the video, and it will be an FRQ question only. There won't be a multiple choice section for this particular exam, simply because, again, we already went over all of those things in Unit 2. If you want to do more practice with multiple choice, you should definitely go to the Unit 2 practice exam and do that again. However, this particular practice test for Unit 5 will be another FRQ style question, because you will see a writing classes FRQ on the AP exam. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started with the review. Alright, so again, this is going to be generally recap of information from Unit 2. What was the main thing that we talked about in Unit 2, right? It was the idea of having objects. Right? Objects, which were, remember, these tangible items within code that you were able to use, you were able to create, you were able to do different things with, right? And if you remember from Unit 2, one of the major concepts from Unit 2 were the 3 different parts of an actual object. The first part is that you had fields, right? And fields describe the properties. They describe the properties of objects. Right? They describe maybe how an object is, right? The actual properties of it. If you remember from Unit 2, I used a analogy of a taxi cab, and I had a little taxi cab object with me. But here, maybe I can use this this marker, right? Over here. This is a glass board marker. So this particular marker, if you look at it, you may be able to describe some of its properties. You may be able to describe that it is the name is the glassboard marker. You may be able to describe that the brand is Quartet. You may be able to describe that the color is blue. These are physical things that you can describe about the actual object. That is what you put inside of fields of the object, right? Then the second part of the of objects that we went over in Unit 2 were methods. Right? What do methods do? They actually define the actions, right? What actions the object can perform. Right? For example, if I go back to this marker, right? The actual object, or some things that it can actually perform, right, is maybe it can write. Right? That's something that it can actually do. Or again, the taxi cab was also a very good example. It can drive forward, right? It can drive backward. You can open a door, you can open the trunk, you can open the hood. Those are all different things those are different actions that you can do using the object. So it's not describing properties of the object, but it is actually completing certain actions. And then the last part of objects that we talked about were the constructor. Right? And the constructor was very special because it defines how an object is created. So it defines how the object is created. For example, in a car, right? You may be able to describe, right, when you're creating the car, what color you want that car to be. You can describe how you're putting it together, right? You can describe what brand you may put on the car. You may be able to describe, how many passengers it can hold. These are all things that the constructor, when it's creating the object, it can set. So pretty much, if you remember, right, the constructor actually sets the values for the fields or initializes the fields when the object is newly created. Okay? And so now all these components of an object, right, the fields, the methods, and constructors, where do you actually write those, right? Where do you actually define those? And you define, so fields, methods, and constructors are defined in classes. So this is where the idea of classes come along. They are kind of the thing that describes, right, and sets the different fields, the methods, and the constructors for a new type, right? That you can have objects of that type that have those fields, that have those methods, and that have those constructors. So again, I can write that classes define object types. Classes define object types. And one of the best analogies which many people use between classes and objects, and it's a very good way to kind of understand the role of classes in relation to objects, right? One of the best analogies that we can use are that classes are to objects as blueprints are to houses. Right? This is one of the best analogies that we can use. Classes, right, define how objects are created, right? And blueprints define how houses are created. And they also define the different things about the house. At the time you're creating the house, you may be able to change certain things, right? You may be able to change the color. You may be able to change, certain different things about the house. Maybe if it has a certain color mailbox or something. And with classes as well, when you're creating an object from a class in that initialization stage, right, you can actually change, or you can tell the constructor how you want to create the actual object, right? And so we use classes to define how and what objects, like how objects are created, what objects can do, and what objects can know, like what actual properties they have there. There's one component also that we went over in Unit 2, if you remember, which is public versus private. Right? And so when you define something as public, you're saying that it can be accessed outside of the class. It can be defined outside, or it can be accessed outside of the class. And when you use private, it can only be accessed within a class. So it cannot be accessed outside of it. It can only be accessed within the class. So can be, or can only be accessed within a class. So when you look at the 4 different things that we have talked about, right? We talked about classes. We talked about fields. We talked about methods. And we talked about constructors. right? These are 4 different things that we can define in our code, right? We define classes, we define fields, right? When we define the class, we define the fields, the methods, and the constructors. So what do we actually set these to if you look at the private versus public? Because you have to choose one. So which one do we use? Which keyword will we use to define these? And so for classes, obviously they're going to be public. And the reason they're going to be public is because you want to be able to access, the entire point of creating a class is so that you can access it outside of itself, right? That's why it has to be public, because you want to be able to access that class outside of, right, that actual class. It just makes logical sense. If you make it private, you will not even be able to use the class that you just made. Now with fields, fields are going to be private. And the reason that fields are generally going to be private is generally for security purposes, in the sense that different objects that are outside of the class, or different things that are outside of the class, shouldn't necessarily be able to have complete access to it, right? It's, for example, something that I can use to define myself, right? Could be social security number, right? I don't want other people, for example, if we use the analogy, other people to be able to access that. So it is something private. It is a specific thing that is only accessed by myself, right? So that is why we set fields generally to private. And then you have methods. And actually methods are very interesting because they're actions that the actual object can do. So this can either be public, right, or private. And this is generally dependent on the actual use case, right? Certain methods you want to be able to access it outside of the actual class. Other methods you only want to access inside of the actual class. Generally, most of the time, it's going to be public, right? But there are some cases where you will want private methods, right? And then the last thing are the constructors. And constructors you want to be public as well, because in order to create an object, you need to run the constructor. So you need to be able to access that constructor outside of the defining class. Okay? So these are all things that we went over in Unit 2, and I do go over in greater detail in Unit 2 as well, but I'm trying to get back your memory of some of these things. Now we're going to go specifically in depth into writing each of these different components, right? So the first part is going to be writing classes. How do we write classes, right? Well, the first thing we do is we have to use our accessor keywords, right? Either public or private. And if you look here, we said that classes should be defined as public. So therefore, we're going to use the public keyword in defining our class. Then the second part of creating a class is we use the class keyword, just like so. And then you put the name of the class that you want to define. So you put the name. And you want to make sure that your name is generally going to be upper case. Actually, I think this is called proper case, not uppercase. It's probably called proper case, where every single new word inside of your name, of course you don't have spaces, you put them together, but every new word is capitalized, right? So that is why classes are very different compared to the other things. The other things you generally use camel case. So the first word's lowercase, then all of the words afterward are uppercase. In classes, all the words are uppercase. And it's mainly just it's just convention, the way you write it. It makes it easier to tell that, okay, this is a class, and then this is a method, this is something else. It's just easy for the programmer and other people, if you're trying to share your code, to actually read what you've done, right? So then you have your open and closing curly braces, or curly brackets, depending on, what you call them. And then inside of the class is where you're going to put your fields, right? Your constructor, and then your methods. Just like that. So those are the 3 things that go inside of the class. Now, how do we write each of these components? Well, we can start with the fields, right? Writing fields. Writing fields. Writing fields is actually not that bad. It's even simpler than writing a class. So the first thing that you do is you want to determine the keyword that you want to use. Is it going to be public or is it going to be private? If you remember up here, we said that fields should be listed as private. So I'm going to write here private, right? And then the next thing I have is going to be what is known as the data type. And this is going to be referring back to Unit 1 as well. But you put the data type of the field, or basically the type of the data that you're going to be storing within the field. And then you put the name of the field that you're trying to create. And then you finish with a semicolon. Now, if you notice, I did not actually use an assignment operator, and I did not use a value. I did not assign a value to this particular field. And why is that? Well, the reason that we leave this initialized, right, is because it is the constructor's job to actually initialize it for you, right? So you leave this initialized because the constructor, activated Siri there, your constructor will initialize it for you. All right, just like that. So writing fields is very easy, and that's all you have to do to write a field. It is very easy to do. It's probably the easiest part of actually writing classes. Now we get into the one that's just a little bit more, it's more involved, if you will. It's not more difficult, but you have to think about more when you're actually creating these. And these are methods. So the next part is writing methods. Writing methods. And again, I'm going to do a little bit of a recap even on the methods one, because we did talk about a few more things which you may have noticed that we did not go over previously that are specific for methods. All right, so we're going to do a recap here. Let me zoom in a little bit. Recap. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to recap are static functions. The difference between static and non-static. If you remember from Unit 2, we did go over this in pretty good detail, but I'm going to repeat it again here, and again write the example between a non-static and a static function. So static functions, right? Static functions are functions that can run directly from a class, right? And static methods do not run from an object. Do not run from an object. So what do I mean by this? And this is best shown, I believe, in an example. So I'm going to show you a non-static function versus the static, if that function was static. So the first thing with the non-static function is in order to use, there are also methods, right? Non-static and static methods. If you hear me interchange the words kind of methods and functions, it should probably be methods. It's simply because in other languages they call these, they actually call these functions. So functions and methods mean the same thing. In Java, it's proper to actually call them methods. So if you hear me kind of interchanging them accidentally, just know that I'm talking about methods. When I mention functions, I'm talking about methods. And make sure to not also make that mistake. If you know other programming languages, this can especially, sometimes you can forget and accidentally call them functions, but they are methods. Okay, so for non-static, the first thing that you do is, because in order to use a method, you need to create an object. So I use my class, which is the car class, and I say A equals new car, just like this. And this defines a new car object, right, from the car class, and I'm setting it to the variable A. Then with my new A object, which is a car object, I can now run the non-static method open door, right? I'm calling it from an object. Now, if it was a static method, then I would be able to do car.open door directly, and this should be lowercase. If it was a static method, you would be able to do car open door directly. So you wouldn't actually have to create an object of the class in order to actually use that method. Okay, so we talked about static functions, and then also the different last thing that we had to distinguish between in Unit 2, there are a lot of things to remember, was returning versus void functions, if you remember. Returning methods or void methods, right? Returning methods, they provide output. So I can write that here. Returning methods, this provides output. Output for a function. Provides output for a function. And then void functions are the opposite, or void methods. This should probably say for a method. Right, again, interchanging them. Void methods do not provide output for the method. So this do not provide output for a method. So it's pretty much that simple, right? Returning functions, they will output a value at the end. However, a void function will not output a value, right? So now, how do we actually create this? Well, the first thing we do, right, is we do our first keyword, which is the public keyword. And again, this can be private in certain cases. If you remember from above, right, methods are the ones that you can kind of switch between public and private depending on the use case. But for now, we'll be using public methods, but it can be private in certain cases, right? And then the next keyword is going to be your static keyword. And this defines, again, if you can use the method without creating an actual object of the class. So static is optional. It is optional. You do not need to include it if you don't want to. And then the last thing you do is you do the return type. And if you're not returning anything, you put void here because to make it a void function. So the return type. And then the last thing you do is you put your method name. Right here, open, close parentheses. Now remember, what do you put inside of your parentheses? You can put in inputs. Right, arg2, ... You can put in inputs here. And those inputs then you can use within your actual method. Then you have your open and close brace, just like that. And then inside of your method is where you're going to write your actions to perform. Because remember, methods perform actions. So within these curly braces is where you can actually define the actions that the method should perform. And then the last thing you can do is you can use the return keyword and return a value. This is, again, only if your method is not a void function and it is actually a returning function. And in this case, you would give that output back. So this would be a final return line if necessary. You don't need to include, remember, a return line if you have a void method. Okay, now the last part of this, so we talked about writing a class, we talked about writing a field, we talked about writing a method. Now the last thing that we need to do is writing a constructor. Writing a constructor. Okay? So when we write a constructor, what do? Well, the first thing we do is we use the public keyword. Because if you remember from above, and I will scroll to it so you can see up here, constructors, you are supposed to define them as public. So we will be defining constructor as public. Then the second thing that we have to do is we actually write the name of the class. So you do name of the class. You're writing the name of the class that the constructor is in, word for word, and case for case, letter for letter. It has to be the exact name, right? Has to be exact name of the class. Make sure to do that. It's very important that you write the exact name of the class here when you are creating a constructor. Okay, and then you do open and close parentheses. And because remember, constructors are a little bit of a fancy version of a method where you are actually creating, because you're still performing an action. So you are now creating the actual you're constructing a new object when you are writing a constructor. So then I can put in my params, or my parameter here. So if you, again, just like with with methods, inside of the parentheses, you use the parameters right here. Okay, then you do open parentheses, or open curly bracket, or curly brace, and then close curly brace. And now the last thing you do inside of your constructors, because what is the main job of the constructor? It is to initialize the fields in a newly created object. So you now need to actually initialize the fields. So how do you do this? Well, what you do is you use the this keyword. So you use this, the dot operator, right? The name of the field that you want to initialize. Remember, you define your fields using these right up here, equals, then you put in your input parameters, or whatever you want to initially set your values to. Then you do a semicolon, just like that. And let me close my comment here. Just like that. So let me kind of explain this a little bit. So I'll talk about the this keyword, right? So the this keyword allows us to access the newly created object. The newly created object that is created when running the constructor. Just like that. So this keyword is actually accessing that new object that you are creating. Then over here, again, this is the fancy name for the dot, in case you didn't know already, is the dot operator. You don't actually need to know that, but it's kind of useful to know. And then you have your field right here. This is going to be your field. And then this is where you would use your assignment operator, right? Assign operator, and then your parameter goes there. Alright, so in this particular video, again, it was supposed to be mainly a recap because we did talk about all of the stuff in Unit 2, but we went over objects again. We talked about the 3 different parts of an object. Again, I really go in depth with this in the Unit 2 video, but we have fields, we have methods, we have constructors. And fields, methods, and constructors are defined in classes, right? Classes define new object types. And if you remember, the best analogy to be able to remember the relationship between classes and objects are that classes are to objects as blueprints are to houses, right? Then we talked about the idea of public versus private, where public, you can access it outside of the defining class. And when private, you cannot. You can only access it within that defining class. You have then over here the suggested keywords to use for all of the different 4 types. You should always write your classes as public. You should always write your fields as private. Depending on what you're actually writing in the method, it can be public or private, but generally it's going to be public. And then constructors, which are always public. Then we talked about writing classes, how you have to use the proper cased name as convention, and you use public class as your keywords to write a class. Then you have writing fields. Now remember, all of these things that I talked about, so writing fields, writing methods, writing constructors, all of those things are written in here, right? Writing your fields, your constructors, and your methods are written inside of the class. And then over here, I have writing fields. I have the private, I use the private keyword to write fields. I use the data type of the field that's going to be created, and then I write the name of the field with then a semicolon at the end. And then remember, I can leave the actual field uninitialized because the constructor will initialize it for me. Right? Then writing methods. We talked about the difference between static and non-static functions. How static functions you can run without actually creating an object. Non-static functions, you do run the actual methods on the object themselves. We then talked about the difference between returning and void functions. Returning functions return output. Void functions do not return any output, right? And then we talked about that you use the public keyword first, generally for methods, but you can use private. Then we talked about the static, right? We talked about static as a keyword, which is optional to use. Then we talked about the return type. We put the return type third. And again, if we don't want any return, we put void in its place. Then you put the method name, which is also going to be camel cased, and then your input arguments within the parentheses, right? And then you put inside of the open and close curly brace, you put all the actions to perform within the actual method, right? And then the last part is writing a constructor. We talked about that you use the public keyword. You have to use the exact name of the class, like down to the casing, down to the spelling, down to everything. You have to use the exact same name of the class as the name of the constructor that you create. And then you have parameters in open and closing parentheses. And then inside we talked about the this keyword, which accesses that newly created object for you to initialize the fields for. Now in the Unit 2 video also, I showed an example where I actually put all of these things together in one specific class. And I believe it actually was a car class. It may have not been a car class, but it was a class. And in fact, I may be able to access that right over here. If I go to the Unit 2, if I can find it, let's see. Computer Science, Unit 2 exam. You can, not the Unit 2, using objects. All right. So in the review, you can see I used the blueprint in the house. And then here is where I actually showed you a full example, right? Where I talked about first you put the class name and then you put your methods or your variables, your fields, then your methods, and then your constructor. So all of that is pretty useful. All right, so I hope that you were able to understand some of these concepts for Unit 5 because, these are going to be reviewed from Unit 2. But it's very important to know these things and how to write classes because you will be asked, especially if you're not taking the exam in 2020, and you will be taking it after, then it will actually be very helpful for you because that is a complete FRQ question, and a lot of people forget some of those little things like, public versus private, or maybe forgetting what static does, or maybe what void does, or maybe the this keyword. So some of those things people do forget, and then that does cost points because they are a little bit picky on that inside of the actual rubric and their grading, their scoring guidelines for the FRQs. So it's very important to kind of review some of these things and keep reviewing them because the next 2 units are actually they're pretty fun units. This one is one that people don't necessarily like that much, but the arrays unit and the array list unit, which are the next ones coming up, as well as 2-dimensional arrays and recursion, all that stuff, they're pretty interesting and pretty fun units. So definitely, as you're doing those, just kind of refer back to this, maybe look at some of the keywords, maybe, practice writing a few classes, and that will definitely help you for the AP exam. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, feel free to like and subscribe for more content. And as always, thanks for watching. There will be a new video, hopefully in a few days. All right, thanks for watching. Goodbye.